Hello, my name is Grandin Gill, and I'm a professor in the Information Systems and Decision Sciences Department of the College of Business of the University of South Florida. And the purpose of this brief video is just to provide a quick introduction to what are known as discussion cases. Discussion cases are a very important type of case study. They're the type of cases used at places like Harvard Business School when they talk about the case method. They're the type of cases used in case competitions. Well, here at the University of South Florida, and particularly in the ISDS department, we have recently started to develop a lot of cases. We're using them in several of our courses, and we're also using them in case competitions that we're running within the department. So I think it's useful for students to develop a slightly clearer idea of precisely what a discussion case is. So just to provide some context, why don't I talk a little bit about some of the different types of case studies that you may have already encountered. One of the most popular is what I call the example case. It's usually a paragraph or two. You'll often find it within a textbook. Maybe your professor will tell you war stories about business. Those are example cases. And typically the purpose of an example case is to provide an illustration of cause and effect that's a little bit more concrete than you might get if you just wrote a theoretical framework with a bunch of boxes and arrows up on the board. The cases also tend to be a lot more concrete, and the story is one of the most resonant ways of communicating. So that's an example case, but that's not a discussion case. Now, another type of case is the exercise case. And an exercise case is a case that's specifically been created as an exercise. Very often, these types of cases are like sophisticated word problems. And as often as not, they're based upon fictitious situations, though often these fictitious situations are created from observations of real life, the way much good fiction is created. But nevertheless, they don't refer to real organizations, real people, and so forth. And once again, these can be a very powerful tool for getting participants in a class to think, but they're not discussion cases. Another type of case is a research case. You see research cases a lot in anthropology. You see research cases in business. And these cases are typically in-depth explorations of an organization or maybe two or three organizations that are created with the hope of clarifying or verifying or falsifying some theory or conceptual scheme that has been developed. Uh, Research cases can be a very powerful tool. A lot of what we know about business was originally discovered through in-depth research of organizations, but they're not discussion cases. Yet another type of case is what I call a showcase. These are the case studies you see up, for example, on vendor websites. Oh, here's a case study of a successful use of our product. And I call them showcases because essentially they're there to showcase some specific success. You don't see a lot of showcases up on vendor websites that show a massive failure. I mean, this is how our product really messed up the customer. Unlikely to see that. I might add, as someone who has written a lot of case studies, most of the time when you go into a company, they would like you to write a showcase, but it's not a discussion case. So finally, we come to discussion cases. And as I will emphasize shortly, the key thing about a discussion case is the fact that it has been created specifically for the purposes of discussion. It's normally authentic, which means it's based on real observations. It's normally open, it doesn't have a right answer. But the whole structure of the case is built around the ability to stimulate classroom or online discussions. So over here on the right, I've got the first page of a 30-page discussion case that I wrote. And one of the characteristics of most discussion cases is they're much longer than textbook cases. Textbook cases can extract the specific facts that they want in order to make a point. But discussion cases aren't there to make a point. Discussion cases are there to create a context in the reader's mind from which a decision can be made. And so there's a lot more information required to create even a partial understanding of the context. Our discussion cases are normally based on field observations. This case, Pathfinder's Eureka, that I've got on the right, is one that was based on a company that was trying to create a social networking site based on geocoding that could also be used for emergency management and disaster solutions. There's a whole range of different topics of discussion cases. There's really no limit, but once again, the best ones tend to be based upon real observations, because if you don't have real observations, what happens is you really are creating a work of fiction, and the case writer becomes too heavily involved in setting the scene. Now, another thing about discussion cases is that they are open-ended. Which is to say, if you read a discussion case, it leaves you hanging. It leaves the manager with a decision to be made, and you don't know what the outcome of that decision is going to be or what the actual decision will be. And in fact, that's very important, because even when you discuss a case in the classroom, you will often not know what the decision is made. During our first semester, when we got an NSF grant to develop a whole series of discussion cases, we developed 11 case studies for use in our undergraduate capstone course. And in 5 of those case discussions, the decision maker was not only sitting in on the discussion, but also hadn't actually made the decision being discussed yet. So very often in a discussion case, you don't know what the right answer is, because there really isn't any right answer. There are good answers and bad answers, and there are a lot of factors that need to be taken into account in choosing between them. Now, the most important thing about a discussion case is it tends to be built around a decision that needs to be made. Any discussion case I write will not just tend to be around a decision that needs to be made, it will be around a decision that needs to be made. And a good case writer will go out into the field and try to find the decisions the managers are making, but not the easy decisions, not the one where the outcome is already known. These are the decisions where the manager really isn't sure what choices are available and what choices should be made. This is the type of decision that makes for a good discussion, because you go into it without the deck being stacked against you. There are 4 alternatives and one of them's the right alternative. That's really not the way discussion cases work. There tend to be better and worse alternatives, but depending upon the assumptions you make, it can have a big impact on what choices you would make. And that leads to the last characteristic of discussion cases. There's rarely a right answer. In maybe 1 out of 20 of the cases that I use, is there really a solution which you might argue is as close to right as you're going to get. Instead, there are shades of gray. But that doesn't mean that these discussions are anything goes, because there are many, many silly discussions that you could make in analyzing a case, and that is what we want to avoid. We want to avoid silly decisions and accept the fact that many of our decisions will have a lot of uncertainty associated with them, and that we have to live with that, because that's the way the real world is. If you're like most students, the first time you're handed a discussion case, your immediate reaction will be, huh? Because discussion cases typically don't come with a roadmap as to what to do with them. They don't tell you to find the value of X. To a certain extent, you have to make those decisions yourself. And the first time you do it, it can be very confusing. I remember for the first week I was doing my MBA at Harvard, virtually all my classmates were totally confused about what to do with these 20 and 30-page cases that didn't have a solution because we're not used to seeing that in our education. So here's the thing that I recommend doing, or the path that I recommend taking when you're getting used to working with discussion cases. First thing you should do is give the case a quick read to get the big picture. Um, the most important thing to get from that read is a sense of what information is in the case, not all the details, just what information is in the case, and most importantly, what decision you are going to focus your analysis on. Because if you don't know what decisions need to be made, then you're not going to be ready to do a good analysis. Now, once you've done that first read, which might take, 20 minutes or half an hour, because it really doesn't have to be an in-depth read, it can really be a skim. Then you want to come back and you want to start really looking at the details of the case and start to study it. This point you might highlight, you might take notes, identify what you think, the key sentences are in the case. A lot of these cases have exhibits at the end. Try to figure out what the exhibits mean and what exhibits are important and what exhibits are there, sort of as a distraction, because you will find distractions in a lot of cases because the real world is full of distractions. Now, once you've done that, sit back and think about the case for a few minutes or a half an hour or an hour or however much time you have. It depends. If you're preparing for a case competition, you probably want to spend a little bit more time thinking about it than if you're preparing for a case that you have to do every week. But the point is, if you don't do some thinking about it and you just jump right into analyzing, you're not going to come up with very creative solutions. You're going to kind of just be looking at the status quo. Now, once you've done that, it's important in your own mind to identify what details in the case are really important and what details are really distractors. And it's not always very easy to tell. If you're doing a case study about a machine tool maker and they talk a little bit about the manager going home for Valentine's Day or something like that, that may not be relevant at all to the case. I don't know that that would ever happen in a case, but hypothetically. On the other hand, if you're talking about a florist shop, Valentine's Day might represent 20 or 30% of their business for the whole year. And as a consequence, anytime you hear about Valentine's Day, that's really, really significant. And so what you need to do is you need to look at the case and try to decide what's important and what's not. What you may find is that different people come up with different conclusions regarding what's important and what's not, because you have to fill in the blanks in a case. Even a 30-page case does not tell you everything you need to know to fully understand a situation. You are going to have to make some assumptions. And if someone makes different assumptions from your assumptions, their conclusions about the case can be very different. Once you've done that, then you're in a position where you can actually do your analysis. Now, if you're going to be using the case in the classroom, then what I recommend is writing out a sort of set of notes that you can use in the event you're called upon to open the case, or in the event that you want to participate during the case and make some very key points. It's really hard to do that from a highlighted case, so I strongly recommend creating notes. Now, if you're talking about a case competition, at the point that you're ready to really jump into the case, that's when you start to prepare the presentation that you're going to be using for a case competition. And there's another video that I've prepared that specifically deals with preparing for case competitions now that we're starting to run some locally. So given that there's no right answer to a case, how do you tell if the analysis that you're doing is on the right track or it's just purely speculative? Well, one thing, of course, is if you're in a discussion class when the case is discussed, you're going to discover a lot of things you didn't think about. But if you're preparing on your own, one of the things that you might want to look at is the puzzle that you're putting together complete? And every case involves putting together a different puzzle, and every individual puts together the pieces of the puzzle differently. So no people are going to come to the same conclusion about the same case necessarily. But if you're putting together the puzzle, you should definitely be checking to see if there are certain things incorporated. One of those things, of course, is Are the people in the case being taken into account? The people in any organizational context are very, very important. And if your analysis of the case and the solutions is completely generic, it doesn't have anything to do with the people described in the case, then there might be something you're missing. Another thing that you want to be interested in is the environment in which the case takes place. This could be the organization, the industry, the culture, and so forth. All of these things are part of the environment facing the decision maker, and they can all have a big impact. If your recommendations don't take into account the competitive environment or the environment in the industry or the culture, then there's a good chance that you may be missing some important things. Another very important thing in most case analyses is the organizational context. What is the organizational structure? Who manages who? Is there any evidence of politicking in the case? All of these types of things can be very important because they can constrain the decision maker and what realistic decisions can be made. If you're dealing with a small business and you recommend a course of action that involves them spending $10 million, that's really unrealistic because if it's a very small business, the odds that they actually have access to $10 million or anyone who could give them $10 million is very unlikely. Moreover, depending upon the business, sometimes the worst thing you can do to a business is give them more money than they need because then they immediately increase expenses, and if they don't get the revenue fast enough, they can put themselves out of business by virtue of having offices that are too nice. And I know this because I left a company, and a couple of years after I left, it went out of business because its offices were too nice. I mean, they were spending way too much on that for the type of business it was. Now, finally, because this is specifically aimed at the information systems and decision sciences students, you're almost always going to want to think about the technology in the case. If your solution has nothing to do with technology, then once again, you want to at least think about whether or not a broader solution would be appropriate. Now, in our department, what we tend to have is two types of cases. We have technology cases where the decisions that are being made could be in almost any area. They could be in human resources. They could be in marketing. Any decision is possible when it's a technology-focused company. On the other hand, we've got some cases of companies that are not technology focused, but have a technology issue, and those are very important too. So if the company makes and sells a new type of ice cream cone, chances are the case is going to be about the technologies they're using for distribution or for tracking cash receipts or whatever, because all the courses or all the cases that we develop in our courses tend to have at least some technology focus. So if there's nothing about technology in your analysis, then you might want to broaden the analysis some more. So the key thing is look at these four areas and make sure that you've at least thought about them. Not every case is going to have a huge environmental impact. Not every case is going to depend heavily on the personalities of the people, but you should at least be thinking about these as you're doing the analysis so that you don't develop a kind of a tunnel vision about the case. What does the best analysis of a case study tend to look like? And this really is true whether you're preparing a case for a class or for a case competition. There's no clear formula for creating a good case analysis. If there was, we'd give you that roadmap. But I would say there are certain things that are almost always true. And the first of these things is that you have to focus your analysis on the decision that needs to be made. In most of the cases that we use that I've developed and that I've chosen, there will be a very clear decision sort of specified on the first page of the case. But that isn't true necessarily of all the cases. A lot of the HBS cases, for example, that we sometimes use in our master's programs don't make the decision that clear. But it has to be clear in your mind when you're doing the analysis. And In some cases, that decision is going to be one where you're given a clear set of alternatives. In other cases, that decision is going to be one where you really have to come up with your own alternatives. But the point is, just because it hasn't given you the information doesn't mean that you can ignore it. You really need to focus on the decision, and if it doesn't give you alternatives, you have to think about how you do this stuff if you were making the decision. Because really, that's what you're trying to do in a case study, take on the perspective of a decision maker and sort of try it out. Now, good analysis almost always builds heavily on the facts in the case. Um, Case studies are designed to be self-contained. We don't really care if you go out and do some external research on the cases, and sometimes for a case competition, that's a winning strategy. But for the most part, when we're looking at your analysis, we want to see your ability to extract important facts from the case while ignoring the irrelevant ones. So don't imagine that a good analysis of a case is going to be 20 pages long and include every fact in the case, because that simply means that you haven't been doing your job of sorting out between what is significant and what is not significant. And that's one of the most important aspects of doing a case. Now, another thing that you're going to have to do in almost any case is make certain assumptions. And you want those assumptions to be sensible assumptions as opposed to silly assumptions. I mean, that goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. What you need to understand is that not every relevant fact in a case can be specified. The case documents simply could not be long enough. And I'm not sure it would be possible to create documents long enough to describe every single thing that might affect a particular decision. What you also find is that sometimes very slight differences can produce very big impact with respect to whether a decision makes sense or not. Just a simple example, suppose you were shipping Christmas trees from Canada to Miami. How significant would it be if the trees arrive on the 20th of December versus the 26th of December in terms of your ability to sell them? That's 5 days. That's not a big deal, but it turns out to be a very big deal in that particular situation. So what you need to recognize is sometimes the assumptions you make will have a very significant impact on what the recommendation is. And sometimes they'll be right, sometimes they'll be wrong, and a lot of times the instructor won't even be able to tell whether they're right or wrong. What's important is that you express that assumption clearly and you build it into your analysis. Now, the final thing that I strongly encourage is that you do not try to hedge. Managers in general hate being wrong. They'd much rather lose $10 by not being right than lose $1 by being wrong, by taking action, having it the wrong action, and losing that $1. And that's really not much of an exaggeration. That's risk aversion. Well, we have the same thing in students analyzing cases. They don't want to make a recommendation that is wrong because that's worse than making no recommendation at all. Well, it's not. I can tell you when I do a case assessments, if somebody doesn't make a recommendation, I immediately mark that person way down, even if their analysis is very good, because the whole point is sometimes in business you cannot avoid making a decision, and we don't want you to get in the habit of avoiding making decisions by simply not specifying your recommendations. That's one form of hedging, but there are other forms of hedging as well. Another is to make a whole bunch of recommendations which aren't even consistent with each other, with the hope of at least having one of them strike home. We might call this the shotgun theory of case analysis, and you don't want to do that either. Choose one recommendation, justify it, stand by it. Now, that doesn't mean you ignore other possibilities. It's fine to analyze the pros and cons of those. And if you're not too sure about your recommendation, it's perfectly reasonable to say, now I rejected these 3 alternatives, but they were very close, and here is the reason why. If you feel like you need to do that, that's perfectly reasonable. But on the other hand, you really need to make a choice. And then the other form of hedging is to say, well, more research is needed. Well, in the world of business, you'll never have as much information as you would like to make the perfect decision. So as a result, The same is true in analyzing cases. You have to deal with imperfect information. Now, from time to time, you will encounter a case where it is absolutely critical that you know a certain fact before taking action. In that case, the recommendation you make involves specifying how you are going to get that specific fact. I have a case which requires that type of action that I wrote on a class that I taught many years ago. And the point is, if the most important thing that you can do is to gather a specific piece of information, then if your recommendation is, okay, here is how you go out and gather that piece of information, and here's what you do if it turns out to have a value X, and here's what you do if it turns out to have a value Y, then that's a decision. That's a real decision. Because sometimes it does make sense to gather more information, but don't use it as a hedge. And if you follow these things, then I believe that you will be able to produce a very, very strong case analysis. Once again, this is true whether it's for a class or for a competition.